Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about securing hosts and data. And the rest of the course, I think, is less theoretical and more that you can actually see. And there are a lot of labs. 6, 7, and 8, I couldn't really separate them. So on the week 2 lab list, it just says 6, 7, and 8, and it's got a whole bunch of them. And work at them at your pace, but please do them. So we're going to talk about how to secure data, how to secure hosts and applications, and how to secure mobile devices. You may be one of those, been there, done that, know how to do that at home, have done that at work, did that in the military. So some of it's going to be new, maybe, some of it not so new. Some of it may be new for everybody. So talk about data classification, and then if you've been in the military, you know about classification already. Policies, data lifecycle, how to control data access, and how to apply encryption. We're going to look a little bit at encryption, and mostly it's going to be what I'm going to do. The demo is the Windows encryption, which when it started out was one of those not so good, but has gotten better over time. The classification levels, and these are the government classification levels that we talk about. Top secret, grave damage, could be done to national security. Secret, less grave, but national security risk. Confidential could cause damage to national security, is less sensitive than secret. And then unclassified is all other. Just because something's unclassified doesn't mean that it needs to be publicized around the world. Some is still only released to approved agencies. The classifications is the impact on national security. Unclassified, there's still a need to know element to all data. Just because it's unclassified doesn't mean that everybody needs to know it. It's just that it's not going to damage. And you know, the classification levels, to enable or to be able to see the material, you have to have the clearance as well as a need to know. Just because you have a top secret clearance doesn't mean that you can go read anything that's top secret that you want to look at. You have to need it, and this is part of the job, the least privilege, the least security, I guess, but least privilege sort of arrangements. Personally identifiable information. The thing that we kind of worry about, and this is NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, defines PII as any information about an individual maintained by an agency, including 1, any information that can be used to distinguish or trace an individual's identity, such as name, social security number, date and place of birth, mother's maiden name, or biometric records, and 2, any other information that is linked or linkable to an individual, such as medical, educational, financial, and employment information. That's a mouthful, but that is personally identifiable information, and that's what we really got to protect to a great degree. It becomes more and more difficult to do that over time for all of them. And any of you that have been involved in that, if you've ever been in a medical, worked in a medical, we've got HIPAA regulations for the medical protection, and we go on and on and on with what is available and what isn't. And then you have to have a statement of what you're going to do with the information. You're not going to share it with anybody and all those other things. And then you get all these ads after you create this new account. So personally identifiable, either distinguish an individual or linked to an individual. And the same things around there: name, address, phone, email, IP address. And you probably, or maybe you haven't, but you know, look at some of these things on the internet. Search yourself on the internet and see what kind of information is available for you. It's pretty amazing. They've got some of mine right and some of mine wrong when I go to look at these things. I guess that one of them was my wife has got the correct address and I don't have the correct address. So as they get updated, these places that say they're not going to share stuff apparently are. ID and bank numbers, big deal. Social security number, bank numbers, credit card numbers, things that are purchasable at a lot of sites for these things. Biometric data, background information, school, workplace, grades, age, gender, race, family members. When we moved here, I had a heck of a time getting a driver's license because what I thought was my birth certificate, and they said, oh no, that's a hospital certificate. What I could get a top secret clearance with, could get a passport with, I couldn't get a driver's license with. So I had to go get one, and it really wasn't that hard to fill out the paperwork, just a little bit of information. I mean, things that they ask you, mother's maiden name, where were you born, sort of arrangement. So the ability or the protection of your personal information, I guess the answer there is just be careful. Protected health information. Educational institutions have to protect student records. When I was in college a lot of years ago, they sent everything to my parents. Even when I was in the Navy and the government was paying for it, Navy was paying for it, 25 years old, all of the billing and all of the grades went to my parents. Now they can't tell your parents anything unless you give them permission to. So they have to protect student records, or student records have to be protected. The PCI, payment card industry, and the digital security standard, these are the standards that protect credit cards. And we've gone around and around and around. Now we've got the chips on them. So what do we do to protect them? And then we go into the near field communications in order to do payment out of the phone. So personally identifiable information. And again, this one kind of jumped from, definitely it's got a lot of things you probably say, yeah, been there, done that, I know that. When we look at some of these things, we have the data owner, the data ownership. So we've gone from personally identifiable information to now we're going to talk about data. And the ownership itself, the owner is the person responsible for keeping the data safe. The HR director might be responsible for employee files, the comptroller for financial data, and on down the line. The data custodian is the administrator responsible for the technical controls. The IT people are going to be responsible for the technical controls under the direction of the owner. They're going to tell us how much protection does the data need. Control permissions to access the data and implement the security controls. And then the data steward is the person responsible for the management from a business and stakeholders perspective. And a custodian and the owner might have the steward duties. The user is anybody that's given access to the data, and then the privacy officer, somebody who oversees the development and implementation of the privacy policies. The privacy policies, how we're going to protect the data. The big thing on the privacy policies is how is the company going to share our personal information? I mean, how exposed is it going to be to the internet? And again, if you have never done a search for yourself, you might want to do that and see what kind of information is out there about you. There's a lot of places, and yeah, they'll sell a lot of information to you if you want to do that, or you see what's available to everybody. States of data. And we've talked about these before. I think in Network Plus we talked about them. The data in transit is the data on the network. The data at rest is the data that is in persistent storage, a hard drive, tape, protected by physical security, host security, or encryption. So data at rest is on a media. Data in use is in processing. It's going to be in the processor, in the memory, protected by the operating system. And data in use is probably the hardest one to protect, because if we do encryption while it's in use, it's going to slow things down. It's going to take CPU cycles in order to do that. Data in transit, we've talked about some of the ways to do that. IPsec, encapsulation, the tunneling protocols, in order to encrypt the data when it goes from the one device to another device. The data at rest, when we store it on our hard drive. That one's not so much, and you've probably looked at those sorts of things and look real quickly at some of that on this. We've got a Windows server here. If I wanted to encrypt in Windows, it's pretty straightforward. This is a professional Windows Pro. I can't do it on my Windows. So if I go in here and do a new folder, I can encrypt the whole folder in the advanced by just simply going in here and saying encrypt the contents to secure the data. Anything that's in the folder is going to be encrypted, and anything that's put in the folder, copied into the folder, will be encrypted. One of the things that happens to Windows, if you copy and paste, it will inherit the attributes of the folder. If you cut and paste, if you move something on the same volume, I got to do that, it's going to retain the attributes of the source. So copying and pasting can do different things for us. Apply this thing, and now it should have back up your file encryption key. This helps to avoid permanently losing access to encrypted files. So it's told me to do that. It's now created an encryption key for me, or at least I hope it has. So let's see. Let's see if we got one in here in the personal certificates, administrator, and that's who's logged on here. This is the purpose. It allows data on disk to be encrypted, all assurance policies. And certification path, yeah, I issued my own certificate. The details are the same things that we have had in it before. The subject alternative name is still this, and the name of the machine is virtualized. We have now issued to ourselves, since we issued it, we're going to trust that certificate, have issued a certificate that allows encryption of data on this system. And it really is supposed to, the color of it, but it didn't do it. Normally it would change the color of the folder, of the encrypted folders. One of the other things that it showed in here, and this is just an oh by the way, it says compress or encrypt. You can do one or the other. Even though it's a checkbox, you can only do one of these at a time. So it be encrypted, and we go in here to the details, the administrator, the certification, thumbprint of it. So we have issued ourselves a certificate in order to be able to encrypt it. If I were going to put that, and I don't want to do that one, new, and the little gold here is a little lock on it, which says that that isn't encrypted. That won't get any bigger, but that it's an encrypted document. So we created it in our encrypted folder. It's going to be an encrypted document when we do that. So we can, in the Windows system, you do the same thing in Linux. We can create encryption for data at rest. Data in transit, we're going to encapsulate it. An IPsec. If we're in wireless, a WPA2, the encryption protocols that we use for these things. The data in use, again, a little bit more difficult. That's the data that's actually in the processor or in the memory. The data life cycle, and again, these are things that you say, yeah, there's nothing really magic about the creation or acquisition of the data. How's it going to be classified? Do you have a formal classification process in the company? Yeah, you were in the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard. There was a formal classification program that when you wrote something classified, you put you put a classification on it, and then a declassification date. How long is it going to be good for? Because what had happened was we were just classifying stuff and putting forever on the declass date, and the classified material was building and building and building. Maybe it was for an exercise that the information only needed to be classified for a few weeks, but that would happen. So how is it classified? What's the formal program that the company has to classify? How do we determine what it is? And usually companies don't use the top secret, confidential. It's certain types of privilege that's available to use in storage. Where is it going to be stored? Who can access it at each classification level? How are we going to determine who can use the information? Who can see the information? How can they use the information? How can they use it with other people? Can they share it? And that's where the need to know comes in. Detention and the archival. How long do we keep it when we're not using it anymore? When does it get declassified? Does it get declassified? Is it something that is so significant that it never gets declassified? And there are some that are that way. And then the wiping and disposal, how are we going to safely get rid of it? Paper is not such a big deal. We can shred it and we can burn it. Shred it and burn it is pretty safe. The shredder you use, whether you use a crosscut shredder or one of those strip shredders like the home shredders are, which is what we've got, and you should be using a shredder for all of the information. It's got anything about you on it. But back in the day, years and years ago now, when the Iranians took over the embassy in Tehran and they were shredding information, they didn't have crosscut shredders. Crosscut shredders make little bitty bits of that you could throw out into public and nobody could put it back together. But the strip shredders, the Iranians got a lot of that, and they actually managed to piece documents back. How are you going to safely dispose of this? How's it going to be deleted? What about data? Wiping data, deleting data, as you know, doesn't really go away. It's still there. It can be recovered unless you use one of the wiping softwares. And there are a number of those that are available in order to do that. And a little bit later, I think there's a slide that has some of them on it. The data loss prevention. This is something that can be a big deal. The data loss prevention agent. The employee sends various emails. Where can they go? What email accounts should be available at work? And I think that we looked at this slide in Network Plus also, but the DLP server, the data loss prevention server, is going to look at these things. And then the webmail over here, can you get to your personal webmail? We may block your personal email accounts. To the suppliers, encrypted social networks, probably going to be blocked, depending on what the company policies are. Partner email domain is going to be encrypted, so that basically what this looks like is that you can do business emails, but you can't do personal emails. The DLP software is used to classify and protect the organization's confidential and critical data when we do those things. How are you going to keep the company's information inside the company? And that's what data loss prevention software will do for us. And who can go where? What can you use? Where can you post things? And social media, I guess everybody's got a little bit. I've got a LinkedIn, which is a social media. My wife does Facebook. But be careful about it, because information there can be, I guess, distributed or used maybe in a manner that you don't want it to be used. And normally social networks, employees are not allowed. Then we jump into permissions, and I'll go back to my server, the NTFS permissions on this thing. I'm going to use the server. Well, let's see if we can do this. Let me see. This should have, because it's, you see, I don't have the ability in here. Well, let's see if we can share it. Oh, new doc.txt. No context, no problem. To start adding the most important people to this. So sharing the classified stuff becomes a bigger issue, although this one may not let me do what I want. Oh yeah, now we have the sharing tab here. When I went to the demo properties, it says that I can share this. It says it's secured, sharing, advanced sharing, and what you normally have to do here is somebody's got to have a key in order to get in, but this is just the folder that we're sharing. When I went to the document, back to the classified document, the properties, I don't have a sharing tab up here. And I guess what are you talking about sharing? There are two types of permissions in Windows. One's called the share permission, so we can share it here, and this is the simplified one. And then we have the advanced sharing. We can share this folder, and we'll name it Dell. And then permissions, we let's see, limit the number of users to permissions here for everyone. It says that they get read. Or we could do full control. There are 3 shared permissions. What sharing does is allows us to see this folder across, and I'm going to go to my server because my workstation isn't really doing what it should be doing. Well, let's see if this one does me any better. This should be an NT. I want to look at these a little bit later. I just left this up so I have a demo here. I can do a share with people. This is one that they added that I never really liked a whole lot. The original sharing was, when we go to advanced sharing, it says that I want to share this folder, demo, and the permissions, I'm going to share it with everyone. Everybody can read this folder. So we have, and you notice that it comes up with the little symbol here, and I'm never quite sure what that little symbol is. I should now be able to go into here, and in security, continue. I can now do what's called NTFS permissions, and that's what the slide was about. And include inheritable permissions. Am I going to allow permissions to be inherited from the object's parent? And the object's parent here would be the C drive. Replace all existing inheritable permissions and on all descendants with the inheritable permission of this object. So we can or cannot do that. We got the creator owner here. If I edit it, we have a whole bunch of permissions here that allows it. We have full control traverse. These are what I would call the more precise permissions. So we can add, let's do a check names here, and let's add the demo group to this, and we'll go to advanced here. And advanced, find now, advanced allows us to find what permissions do we want to give them. Full control, yeah, we've got a whole bunch of permissions here that happen. Apply it. We can limit what goes on. Okay, so I guess I need to get around to what's this NTFS and what's this share. When you share something, it allows the folder to be accessible over the network. And we had the 3 permissions that were available in the share. I'm going to go back to the share. The 3 permissions here in advanced sharing were, now let's see, the permissions are full control, change, and read. Not a whole lot of information. If I do that, so that's really very dangerous. And maybe it is, and maybe it isn't, because you can only use the share permissions through the network. They're not enforced locally if I log on to this machine. The NTFS permissions are. So if I go to the security, the NTFS permissions here, and these are the ones that I really wanted earlier, not the advanced, are local. So what I can do, if I share something and give it NTFS permissions, I get the most restrictive. So if I added this demo group and didn't allow them to log on to the device here, and we wanted them to only be able to read information out of here, we could give them that. When we put the NTFS and the share permissions together and it's accessed across the network, you get the least permissions that are available. So in this case, full control for the share and then read for the NTFS. That's kind of a lot for not very much. But here's the list of permissions. Read can view the contents of the folders, can view the contents of a file. NTFS permissions are local permissions when we log on to a system. If you have NTFS at home, you can give NTFS permissions on the files, and if you want to create something on your home machine and not give somebody else the permission to look at a document, you can do that. If you want to give them permission to read, or just don't give them permissions to it at all. NTFS and New Technology File System are local permissions on a Windows machine. Write, the user can add files and create subfolders. Read and execute is what we're normally going to give for executable files. User can run executables contained in the folder. Is inherited by any subfolders and files. So in the list, the folder contents, you might not want that to happen. Read permissions plus a user can run executable files. We had an instance where we did that. we created for users to for students to put their homework into a folder, what we call a poor man's Dropbox, so that when they put their homework in, you didn't want them to see everybody else's homework. You had to give them permission to write. They had to be able to put theirs in, and when you write, you get implicit read. So we didn't have read on the folder. They could write, but they couldn't list the folder contents, because then you put it in, you would allow them to just, go get somebody else's homework and do a copy and a paste to do those things. So there are instances, maybe not a great example, but there are instances when you don't want to list folder contents. Read permission plus the user can run executable files in this one. Permission is only inherited this permission is inherited by subfolders only, and then modify, read-write permission plus the user can delete a folder. And that's different up here when we had write, the user can add files and create new folders. So modify, they can delete folders here. And then full control is full control. You can do everything. If you don't assign a permission, no access is the default. And effective permissions, but this is another implicit deny. If I create a folder and I give John permissions to that folder, and I don't give Candido permissions to that folder, then Candido has an implicit deny, simply because I gave permissions to somebody and didn't give permissions to them. So you can, and that's how home directories typically work. Why can you get to your home directory and nobody else can? Because you've got permission to it and they don't. So they are implicitly denied with that one. And the rest of the slide here, users' permission are the sum of the permissions. They have been assigned individually and obtained through any groups of which they are a member. Okay, so now I've introduced a couple of terms here. I used a group when I did the permissions. Typically, we're going to, instead of managing users one at a time in the mass, in the whole, we're going to assign them to groups, and then we're going to give permissions to groups, because students typically need permissions to certain resources. So we create a students group, put all the students in it, and assign them access to that resource. Instructors may have a different set of resources that they use, and they may need also access to the students. So we would give them access to both through an instructors group. So any permissions that I give to a user, any groups that I put them into, they're going to have those permissions plus any individually assigned permissions. And they all become additive or cumulative. If at demo folder, if one group I got a read-only permission and another group I got full control, I'd have full control, because I'm always going to get the highest level of permission that I have, except when we access something across the network. When we have a share, and the share uses the SMB, the server message block protocol, to allow us to see those resources. If I share it across the network and then give it NTFS permissions, if I have a full control for the share and a read-only for the NTFS, I'm going to have the read-only. I'm going to have the least, or the most restrictive, the least powerful. So those are going to be the effective permissions. We assign Jake read permissions to the reports folder. Jake is a member of the accounting group, which have been assigned modify permissions. Then Jake has a modify permission on the reports folder, because you get the highest level. It's cumulative. They say cumulative, but what it amounts to is you're going to have whatever the highest one is. The exception rule is individually. The rule is if individually or through a group Jake was explicitly denied, and this is a big deal. If you have an explicit denial of a folder or a file, regardless of how many other permissions, you can have full control in 14 other groups and you're still going to be denied. An explicit deny is a deny. The only way to get rid of an explicit deny, and that's when we go into the permissions, and on the left side it said was what they gave, on the right side was the denial in those check boxes. Once I do it and I is denied, the only way to get rid of it is go back and uncheck that check box. And the Linux permissions are read, write, and execute. And users are owner, group, and others. This is, I have a stupid little acronym for that. It's UGA, you know, the Georgia Bulldog, which is users would be the owners, and then the group, and then the A is all others. So all other users. The user, and these are written in binary. They're going to look something like, if I can get back to the pen, if I do a 777, that's a 4, 3, 1, which is read, write, and execute. I think I've got those in the right order. So we could have a 777, which gives us full control, read, write, and execute to A. So we could have the 777, which is going to be 4, 2, and 1, not 4, 3, and 1. 1, 2, 6 is 7. You guys didn't help me out there with my binary. Which is 7, which is going to be the read, write, and execute. So a 6 would give us a read and a write. A 1 would give us an execute, and a 4 read for these things. So we have read, write, and execute. Read, the users can view the contents of a file. Write, modify, just like we had in Windows, and execute, can run an executable file in the directory. So Linux is kind of like the Microsoft share permissions. In the file attributes, the attributes themselves, we have read, archive, system, hidden. And if you really want to see them, which ones are written, you can see them through the GUI, or you can go backslash, I'm a cdc : do the attrib, and it tells me that I've got archive, and I've got the S here, which is what, the system, and the H is hidden, and then the R, which is read only. These are some system files. The boot manager here is A, which is archive, which means it hadn't been backed up. The E for encrypted. D for directory, not content indexed, not included in index search, and then compressed if it's a compressed file, and E for encrypted. So we have the attributes that are available on, let me go back to my server here real quick, and let's go look at this one, properties, and I forgot which ones I did encryption on, so do a new folder here. I'll change color and then we'll take a break. Encrypt these things are down here in advanced, and we'll go to encrypt them. And yeah, it turns it green. And that's what should have happened. That's why my workstation really wasn't doing that right. But when it encrypts something, it's going to turn the folder green. So read only. So what we did, we looked at the contents, the hidden properties of this one, obviously. And it says it's a read only, applies to files in the folder. We can make it hidden. And the advanced says that it is encrypted. I guess that we can look real quick. I'm stalling it. I want to start a new slide. And files for the attributes, not the attributes of the folders. So I just want it to show, and see, and it is green also. And it just says that it needs to be archived. So that's why I wanted to say I'd never seen an E in an attrib. Could be compressed, could be encrypted. We can see that in the permissions in the advanced if it's encrypted, and it can be compressed or encrypted in Windows. You can't do both because there's something about the encryption and the certificates and the way that the encryption works that it modifies. Questions? Going once, going twice. I told you this one's disjointed, and I guess that I'm disjointed too. But questions, comments? If not, let's go ahead and take a break and come back at 10 past. Okay, we'll keep going. If you watch the video, you're probably going to have the break in there with silence. Anyhow, the share permissions, which we looked at on the server, read, change in full control, read, file names, subfolders, and data, run programs. These are a little bit broader than the NTFS permissions. The NTFS permissions tend to be more specific. And then when you get into when you saw in the advanced, you can get even more specific than the general NTFS permissions. Change, read permissions plus adding, changing folders. Each of the levels implies the level above it. So change implies read, and full control implies read and change. So full control is change plus can change the NTFS permissions. So the NTF, we can now change permissions, change the NTFS permissions, so we can give others more permissions. NTFS has the same thing. Storage encryption, removable drives are a big deal. The one from DoD, from the civilian health or civilian personnel, whatever it's called, I don't remember. What happened there was a laptop, but there have been people that have taken these files out with personal information on them, on flash drives, on laptops, and I don't think on tablets or phones yet, but you certainly could, and lost them. So when they lose them, that's a lot of people. And I think that the DoD one was, I don't know, it was hundreds of thousands of people, and they had to notify everybody, and they've had to for the last several years by identity theft that keeps coming and coming and coming. So the greatest risk of the USB drives, and USB drives can be encrypted if you buy the encryptable ones, and if you use an operating system or a file system that you can encrypt with. On the hard drives, NTFS obviously are good, or is what we use in Windows now. But if you go back to FAT, we can't encrypt a FAT drive. You can't encrypt a FAT drive, and I always had that thought, golly, that means that the ransomware people couldn't encrypt my drive if I use FAT. But FAT's pretty insecure. It's very insecure. But all of these things, kind of go around in your head when you do that. And that's what the ransomware people do. We talked about public-private keys. They encrypt your hard drive. And after you pay them, you get the other key so you can decrypt. So encrypt drives and access the read-only partition, and we can encrypt the entire drive. On a Windows machine, we can encrypt the entire hard drive. On a Linux machine, if you do that, please back up. I had a friend who did that. It's gotten a lot better, but I had a friend who did that, and it failed. And when it failed, he had a doorstop for a long time. Install everything. Encryption storage, mobile devices, the new devices, the updated devices allow us to encrypt the entire device, which is something that you probably want to do. And I think it has to be with the PIN, I think, mostly to do that. That's because it uses the PIN as part of the generation of the encryption key process. Archive file encryptions of zip files, and 7-zip and RAR are stronger, and 7-zip is open source. If you need an encryption and compression software, 7-zip, it is a really straightforward one. We can add, extract, test, copy, move, delete. You can, and if I just wanted to encrypt something, we can go here, or encrypt. I keep saying encrypt, I mean compress. If I right click on it, then I get a 7-zip, add to archive, compress. I can make a .7z a 7-zip, or I can use the zip, the ZIP, the zip algorithm in order to do the compression of these things. Databases, transparent encryption, and then we have file or full disk encryption. We've looked at file encryption. Full disk encryption is available. A little bit different setup. We'll get to that slide here in a minute. The encryption hardware, the hardware-based disk encryption have a chip on the drive controller, secure and fast. A smart card, a cryptographic chip on the card, and we've got these chips for all these things. USB, hardware dongles or flash drives, and they're going to store the keys. The trusted platform module, the TPM, the chips on the motherboard, all of these things are going to be able to generate the keys that we need for the encryption. And the hardware security module, an external device, frequently network-based. The trusted platform module for the full disk encryption of Windows, if it's not available, you can still do BitLocker by storing the key on a USB drive instead of the TPM. If you don't have a TPM, but most of the newer machines, if you've got a machine that you bought probably within the last, I don't know, 5 or 8 years, it's going to have the chip on it to be able to generate these keys, encrypt the data. The encrypting file system, the one that we looked at on the server, encrypts individual files and folders controlled by the individual, intended for personal files. When we encrypt this thing, you saw that it generated a key. What the system does is when we use the encrypting file system to encrypt a document, it creates a symmetric key. It creates its own key and encrypts the document with that key, uses the EFS key to encrypt the encryption key. A lot of encryption going on there. That key, and then stores the key that it used to encrypt the document within the document itself. So it's not really safe, but you have to have the key that we generated in order to decrypt let's call it the symmetric key, the asymmetric key to decrypt. And then we can use it to decrypt the document. So the key is actually stored as part of the document itself. BitLocker protects the entire volume. Controlled by the administrator, intended for full disk encryption. So if we want to encrypt the entire disk, it's BitLocker. But remember, anytime that we do these encryption, decryption, it's going to take some CPU cycles. It's going to slow things down a little bit. So encrypting the files, we did that, I think. Right-click on the file to choose Advanced. Check Encrypt Contents to secure the data. Click OK twice in order to do that. So, nothing really magical there, all through the GUI in order to, when we want to encrypt. And the Microsoft's not bad anymore. It used to be not real good. And then the BitLocker here encrypts the entire volume, uses the TPM, the Trusted Platform module by default. We can do it without it, but it requires a group policy change, and then it's going to store the key on a USB drive, and you have to have the USB drive, obviously, to start the system up. Three authentication methods in this. The normal startup is going to check the boot files. The user authentication, provide a pre-boot PIN, and then the USB key, we're going to insert the USB key. So over on the right here, we have the primary NTFS volume, NTFS being one of the keys to being able to encrypt, because we can't encrypt a fat volume. We have to have NTFS or GUID in order to do that. GUID is used for drives that are 2.2 terabytes and above. NTFS on 2.2 terabytes and below to do those. So we just usually for memories purposes, we usually just, when we were doing it, say, okay, if it's a 2 terabyte, I got to have a GUID partition. The secondary NTFS volume is an optional on this. So the primary NTFS volume, the C drive, will do those things. The TPM, the Trusted Platform module, secures the hardware. The startup key, it's a secondary key, and then the PIN or password is a secondary key. So if you need to encrypt the entire volume, BitLocker for Windows. There are other softwares that are available to do that. Some you can just make a secure, they call it encrypted locker. Some of them have better issues than others, and are other issues with this. BitLocker drive encryption in the control panel. BitLocker encryption, turn it on. When you do that, it's going to go through the process, it's going to encrypt the hard drive. Will take some time. Media destruction. How are we going to get rid of this stuff? How are you going to get rid of hard drives? Pulverizing, hydraulic or pneumatic processing for these things reduces the media to loose fibers. Hard drives, to me, are one of the really, how do you get rid of them deal. We had, and I think I probably said this, we had a company that gave us, I don't know, 50 or 100 machines, but no hard drives. They maintain the hard drives. There are shredders that will get rid of them, but hydraulic or pneumatic processing for these things. If you're doing it at home, one of the easiest, quickest ways to do hard drives is drill holes in it, or take the platters out, take it apart, take the platters out, and I guess scrape all of the magnetic media off of it, something like that. Reduces pulverizing, pulping Paper recycling reduces documents to a slurry, separates the ink from the fibers. Incineration, an unrecognizable ash. Shredding is the easiest thing to do. If you shred it and burn it, then you're probably going to be in pretty good shape. Burning, you need to be sure that the entire everything got burned when we do that. So different ways to get rid of these things. And you have seen, we talked a little bit earlier about the different type of shredders. And a crosscut shredder makes it a confetti sort of arrangement. The strip shredders, some people have had an issue, and the Iranians actually did put some of that stuff back together. Securely erasing data from your hard drive and just deleting something. There are a number of softwares, and if you have some issues, my son had a hard drive that he had a bunch of music on. This was quite a few years ago, and it lost its partitioning information. It just didn't have any directory, no partitioning information, no real partition. It just had raw data. I got a piece of software, and I think it cost $35 at the time, called Get Back, that was able to recover that. At the time, I think it was a 2 gig, maybe a 10 gig. It was a long time ago. They weren't really that big, but recovered all but one file. So this information that we put on the magnetic disks is going to be there for a while. Securely safe to delete, both for business needs and regulatory compliance. Install a secure deletion program. S-Delete, CCleaner has one. Eraser, File Shredder. There are a number of softwares that will do that. These are processes that are approved by the NIST, by the NSA actually, the National Security Agency, in order to securely erase. It's like it has to make 10 passes or something like that in order to actually make the data go away, or it's going to be recoverable as long as the disk media is intact, the magnetic media is intact. Securely erase the entire, use a formatting tool from the drive utilities, perform a low-level format which writes zeros to the entire drive. The low-level format, for all of you A+ folks, know that that's something that is done at manufacture. The low-level format, the quote, prepares the disk for the operating system. A lot of, and I don't think that the new BIOSes say low-level format. In the older days, in the DOS days, there was a do a low-level format on a drive. What they said was it really never actually did a low-level format. So that may or may not be an option. The other applications that are probably a little better here. Data destruction, DBAN, HD shredder, kill disk, so some more softwares. There's software out there that can securely erase, yeah. It or only the factory can write ones and zeros. The factory does the low-level formatting. The low-level, we use the format command, that's a high-level format, that writes the operating system onto it. The low-level formatting writes the actual, draws the sectors onto the hard drive, and then the high-level formatting puts the sectors together for management purposes through the directory. So the low-level formatting manufacturer, there are tools that you can get to do a low-level format, but the hard drive heads, the rewrite heads themselves, don't have enough electrical capability to actually do a low-level format. Does that make any sense? Because I had that was a question. It was a privately, but so okay. Don says yes. How about the guy that asked the question? Okay, got it. Thank you. Yeah, that's I mean. Okay, the low-level format is something that's done at the factory. It writes the sectors. When you do, if you did A+, you talked about block sectors that were written out on the disks themselves. They're storage areas, individual storage areas. The high-level formats that are done by the operating system or by the systems themselves put the directory system on it and group the blocks together that are low level into larger storage areas, so that the operating system can store files and retrieve files. So low-level formatting, and the low-level formatting, what this says, what I'm saying is that this bullet, write ones and zeros to the entire disk. Yes, that's what we want to do. That's what the softwares do that we get. But to overcome or to rewrite the low level, the disks themselves, today's hard drives don't have enough power capability in the read-write. If you've ever looked at one, they're really small. They've got like one turn of wire as a transformer in order to change the orientation. Hopefully that makes some sense. Drives protected full disk encryption, easy to securely erase. SSD can be difficult to securely erase. It's basically one giant flash drive. There are again other softwares that are available for it. Firmware and settings in the hardware and the network appliances and mobile devices obviously can have valuable information in them. And the network appliances, mobile devices are one of the big problems that we have. How do you keep them secure? How do you dispose of them? How do you keep track of them? And that's the topic of one of the other modules here. So we'll talk a little bit about securing hosts. The hosts here, let's say workstations. Although there are some other devices that we need to secure. We need to be sure that have the security actions taken. Routers, switches, Internet of Things stuff. Internet of Things things. But, like the environmental controls, what are we doing with those things? The production controls, the things like the Iranian centrifuges, industrial controls when we do that. So we're going to talk about security baselines, how to secure hosts, how to perform patch management, and to secure static and unconventional systems. Static systems are ones that kind of have built-in operating systems in them. Baseline considerations, and this one really has just a lot of, okay, here is a list of things that we can do. Operating system configuration. How are we going to configure the operating system? And Windows is probably easier, at least easier for me to talk about. Linux configuration. Linux is a little bit different. Linux probably has more, although Windows has gotten there, more inherent security in it than Windows does. Although Windows now, instead of making us the administrator with unlimited authority, which it did not very many editions ago, XP, now makes us a regular user. And if we want to do something administrative, it says, do you want to do this? And we can configure it to where we can just click yes, or we can configure where we have to do a password. Linux doesn't ask you that. Anytime that you want to have super user authority, root authority, administrative authority, you can put in password. It just makes you do that. So that if you're getting ready to make changes, it tells you you're getting ready to make changes when we do those things. So how we're going to configure the software, we're going to have it as click, yes, I did that. I want to do that. Yes, I just did this. Or do we want to say, no, you can't do it at all until you become a different user? Or do we want to make them put in a password? One of the things that you can do with Windows, I can get something up here, but if you right click on something, on an executable, you can run it as administrator. This one is running, and I can't get my, maybe I can too, get my executables over there. Let's see if we can. But if you're running as an ordinary user and you want to do something, need to do something, run something, you should be able to right click on it and run it as the administrator. And now you have administrative authority with that application, and you don't have to be logged on as the administrator. And I don't know if it was here or in probably in Network Plus, but years ago, a virus going around called the I Love You virus. And we had an instructor who, for some reason, he was the electronics department head, and I guess because he was a department head, had been given administrative full control, administrator authority on the server. And he was so proud of it that he was always logged in as the user, as his administrative user. Well, he got this email from somebody, somewhere, that the subject line was, "I love you," and couldn't resist. So he did a lot of damage to the server simply because he was logged in as an administrator. If he'd been logged in as a regular user, couldn't do that. So, and it always, well, I don't want to log off and log back on, log off and log back on. In Windows, that's not an excuse because you can right-click it and run as administrator. You can do those things. Other things that we need, the host-based firewall, IDS software. They properly configure them. I'll say the host-based firewall, some people say, yep, absolutely, positively got to have it. And some say, well, not so fast, but we've got a network firewall, so we really don't need the host-based firewall. The argument there, I would say, is that if you get an infection for whatever reason on your network, and it may be something as simple as we had a work study that was putting an operating system on a machine and did something and got a virus, and all of the machines that were unprotected and unfirewalled immediately got that virus. I was teaching a Windows class, and we didn't use operating systems on the class machines, and we got the virus. And it infected the entire room in a matter of seconds. Good practice on taking viruses off after you do that. So we need host-based firewalls, IDS, anti-malware software, required and disallowed applications, application security settings, patches and updates, all the things that you heard before. Physical security, who can get to the devices, patches and updates, how are we going to update these things? And what I want to show applications as the required and disallowed applications, and I think there'll probably be another slide, but that's part of what I had open here, that we can, in Windows, we can make rules about, this is, it's a software restrictions is the name that we have here. And when I do this, I can do additional rules. I can do a new certificate rule, a hash rule, or a new network zone rule, or a new network path rule. This is where the hashes come in, that we would hash an executable, and we would use its hash here in order to do that. They use the rules to override the security by default, and the default security is going to be, either permit everything to be run except what we blacklist, or to don't let anything run except the things that we whitelist. And whitelisting, say, oh yeah, I can do that with apps, but some executables call other executables, and they go on and on and on, and you have to have all of them in the list. They don't inherit in that sense. So we can designate which applications that we maybe want to prohibit from doing. So we have a new hash rule here. We have the security level, basic user, unrestricted, disallowed. So what we're going to do with that one is we were going to say, no, you can't run it. That it is going to be disallowed. So we can restrict applications that can be run on the systems. Patches and updates, we want to do that. Typically what we're going to use in a Windows system is this thing called a Windows WSUS server, Windows System Update Server, which in an Active Directory domain will go to Microsoft, get all of the updates, and then we use the local software in order to distribute the updates to all of the workstations. One of the things WSUS does is it inventories all your machines and tells you what the patch status is of them. So you can see which ones are missing patches, which ones are not updating properly, which ones haven't been updated. And then physical security, who can actually reach out and touch something. Physical security, physical access can be a really big deal on these things. The Windows Baseline Security Analyzer is something, you pick a computer to scan. I thought I had done this one. Well, we'll look at what it does, but it's the, we start to scan. I'll come back and look at that a little bit later, see if it finds itself. And what it'll do is scan this thing. It should find some errors because I don't have auto updates on this virtual machine, because every time I did it, it messed up my virtual NIC. Baseline Security Analyzer is going to check the Windows machines, basically for Windows updates and any security holes that it sees. We'll look at that one after it has a chance. It takes a few minutes for that to get done. It does do it. It says it is. Anyhow, code signing. We talked about signing certificates. Modified software is going to be risky. All softwares can be modified. The signature verifies that the signer claims it's safe. It doesn't do anything to say, yes, it is safe. It says that the signer claims that. And Windows now looks for signed drivers. Windows signed drivers. That there is a certificate associated with the drivers. If somebody hasn't put something in that's going to do damage. Private signing keys can be compromised. When we talked about keys, we had the question, can these be compromised? Absolutely. Can they be spoofed? What the code signing gives protection only if the operating system can check for the signatures. And the signatures are on the certificates. So go back to the certificates. They're signed by the certificate authority. Certificate authority gets compromised, then we've got a problem because all the certificates signed by it now have to become invalid. But the keys are used to sign the software, the programs, the operating systems, or documents, or emails, and then the gives protection. The operating system checks the signature on the certificates for the keys themselves, or to be sure that they haven't happened. And the trusted system. This is the TPM module. That's the right hand side. That's what the chip looks like. It's going to be a chip on the motherboard. Code signing for software, UEFI, secure boot, the key stored in the firmware, and it's going to refuse any bootloader not signed by the public key owner. And the public key owner, these chips are key generation devices. They're going to generate the public key. So we're going to have the operating systems, the bootloaders are going to be signed to verify the drive signatures to be sure that somebody hadn't modified the operating system. That what we think we have is what we have. And the TPM, the Trusted Platform Module on the motherboard, a specialized chip on the devices that stores the RSA encryption keys specific to the host system for hardware authentication. Each chip contains an RSA key pair called the endorsement key. It's going to generate the keys, and what these do is prevent, for one thing, somebody putting a different operating system in or moving our hard drive from one system to the other. If the keys don't match, the system won't run it when we do those things. One of the steps that have been taken recently to try to overcome some of the attacks that we have that go to the very basics of the operating system, the startup, that we have a corrupted operating system. So now they just won't start. Trusted operating systems, strong authentication, strong authorization, and the goal is least functionality, which kind of sounds like, do I really want to do that? Least functionality. I want to make my operating system as least functional as possible, and we really do, because it's just like the permissions that we want to give to users, that we want to give them the least amount of permissions that they need to do their job. We want to give it the least amount of authority that it needs to do its job. Strong authentication and strong authorization. A secure operating system, and let me drag this search over here real quick. We'll talk about this. Examples of certified trusted operating systems, and EAL4 is the one that the slide has got, and yeah, it's a pretty secure, methodically designed, tested, and reviewed. Mac is EAL3, and the higher the number, the better on these. HP EAL4, Linux distributions EAL4, is 4+. Windows 7, you can see, kind of get an idea of when this particular one was written. 4+, and then some others, Pitbull Foundation, the Trusted Solaris, Trusted Unicast, 8 items. So the listing that is available on these systems, and this is within Wikipedia. And I think that this article, the functionality tested, applicable where some confidence is required, requires cooperation of the developer in terms of delivery design, but should not demand more accurate effort on the part of the developer. Methodically tested and checked is structurally tested. And 2, methodically tested and checked. 4 is methodically designed, tested, and reviewed. 5, semi-formally designed and tested. Maximum assurance from security engineering based upon rigorous commercial development. And then 6, verified, tested, verified, designed, and tested. And 7, formally verified, designed, and tested. The 7 is the highest level. So EAL 4 is kind of the target of what we want for our workstations and servers when we do those. Methodically designed. Account controlled, and in the accounts we have users, ordinary users, regular users that can use the software, can't install the software, administrator, and if you can't install the software, to me the advantage is you probably can't install the virus either, because we've got executables with these things. The administrator, and then the guest types. Access control with local and network permissions. Those were the share permissions and the NTFS permissions. Autoplay. How are you going to configure autoplay? Are you going to turn it off? Are you going to allow, you put in a DVD or you plug in a flash drive, you're going to allow autoplay to automatically start up. And the autoplay on, one of the issues there becomes obviously the executable can become an autoplay. Unnecessary services, and we've talked about unnecessary services. Turn them off, turn them off, turn them off, turn them off, turn off the unnecessary services. Directory services, what are we going to use? Active Directory causes us to have a security policy across the entire Active Directory domain. So we can apply the security that we need to all of our workstations simply by making them a member of, and that's, passwords, how long, complex passwords, how long do we keep them, how long, what's the length of the passwords needed. Account lockout, if we miss the password so many times, when's that going to happen? So the things that we can do in order to do that. And then updates, we can update centrally using the software that's provided, and the Microsoft software provided free for those things. Peripherals, external ports, are you going to allow users to plug things in? External storage devices, flash drives, SD cards, wireless cards. Digital cameras can be an issue because they have connectivity as well as the ability to store or take pictures of, images of areas that you might not want to be outside of your network. So what are you going to do about them? Are you going to allow cameras into certain areas of the network, or are they going to be prohibited in some areas? And wireless devices, keyboards and mice. Bluetooth uses the encrypted connection. Other proprietary protocols are not going to do that. And then shoulder surfing. If people have the mobile devices, laptops in particular, out in public areas, what's going to happen? The different things that lots of lists of what we're going to do. Securing applications, we looked at that. We can whitelist them or blacklist. License compliance. This is a big deal for companies, that you actually own all the licenses that you have. It can be checked. There are law enforcement agencies that can come around to businesses to do those things. Secure applications. What are they? What applications do need to be secure, and how secure do they need to be? Network components. How do we secure the network components? How do we secure the switches? How do we secure the routers? How do we update them? How do we know when updates are needed for them? Can we download them? They're not as simple as Windows, where you push them out with your WSUS server. You actually, for the routers, you typically have to download it and then upload it when we do those things. The browser securities, and which network protocols do we have? We're using IPv4. Not so secure. Are we using Telnet? Not so secure. What network protocols, and we need to go to the SSH to those kinds of things in order to have secure communication, secure in-band communications with these things. Security software, antivirus. Are the definitions up to date? How often are the definitions updated? We had a centralized antivirus that was managed centrally from a machine, and it got virus updates in probably every hour or so. The antivirus updated on the central device, and then it would push them out to the systems themselves, so that the antiviruses hopefully stay up up to date on the system itself. The firewall. Do we have firewalls, anti-spyware, pop-up blockers, advertising and adware, those kinds of things in the pop-up blockers? And there are a number of them out there, although I saw recently, and I don't remember which one it was, that the pop-up blocker was spyware sort of arrangement. And a lot of, or at least some places you go to say, oh, we make our living with ads. So unless you turn off your pop-up or your adware, we're not going to allow you to look at what goes on here. Anti-spam. If the ISP, and you may be running your own, if you do, you have to run something like Spam Assassin on your own email server to get rid of as much spam as possible. A friend of mine went to work at a company that was an international company that had an office in Virginia, and he said that when he got there, like 80% of the emails that came in were first thing he had to do was teach his spam software how to recognize Active Directory usernames, so that the first thing you could reject was email that came into the email server that didn't go to anybody. Spam, how do we get rid of it? And if we need more protection other than at home what the ISP gives for us. The host intrusion detection system, and then file integrity monitor, that the files have not been manipulated. This is one, physically securing devices. A number of ways to do that, and they talk about basically strapping down the things, physical security. Laptops have a connection point where you can put a lock on them. Other devices. Yes, Candida. Are you sleeping? Is that what you're telling me? Somebody wake him up. Maybe he didn't. I don't know. Yes, I know. You know this, right? So malware, symptoms. Quarantine the individual devices, and quarantine may just mean unplugging it from the network. When you get these malware viruses, they can spread very quickly. And experiencing the one, and it got through. Then I guess we had probably 15 or 20 students in that class, and all of the machines were infected, and probably about. It is something, when you say quarantine, you need to isolate the machine that has the issue. Disable the system restore. Repair the infected system, that's all it is. Update the anti-malware, because that's probably why we got it. Scanning and removal tools, and sometimes it's easier said than done in order to get the malware off of the system. Update and schedule future scans, and then enable the system restore, create the restore points after the malware has been removed from the system. Educate users, and educate users is always going to be one of the issues that we want to do, and document your findings that we have for those. So hopefully Candida's the only one that I put to sleep. So questions or comments? Let's go ahead and take a break and come back, and let's keep going with the quarantining of the systems. And you probably already figured most of this out. Isolate the removable devices or backups. Disable the network shares and the file sharing applications, ongoing connections to other computers. And we can see that the ongoing connections with the NetStat application to see what we're connected to. Identify, isolate other computers that might be infected. We want to isolate all of the infected machines, get them off of the network, limit network connectivity, and My idea of limit network connectivity is unplug it from the network so that it can't infect the other devices. You want to minimize the damage, and I know we talk about, yeah, as long as it's not doing any more damage, go ahead and observe what's going on. You want to be sure that it's not doing any more damage and it's not distributing the payload. When you disconnect, the attacker is going to know that something's going on if there is an attacker involved in these things. And these we're really kind of talking about viruses and the other malwares that may be on the system. Infected systems remediation, updated tools, multiple tools, more than one in order to do that. And I would suggest that you may want to look at our friend Google, because if something's happening to you, particularly in the Windows world, it's probably not the first time. There may be, and it very likely will be, procedures, those things. Sometimes you've got to go deeper than running the software and deleting it or isolating the virus. Sometimes you've got to actually get in and do edits to the registry to take it out. The operating system scan. Sometimes you need to go in safe mode because Windows has trouble doing things. Deleting an open file, for instance, is something that it doesn't do well. So if the virus is running, you may have to go into safe mode in order to actually get rid of it. And that's the next one is try safe mode to restore the environments. Bootable rescue disks, removal tools target to the specific infection, and there may be some of the viruses are very, very specific, and the antivirus companies usually will make these available to everybody for free. You don't always have to be a subscriber in order to get the tools to remove specific viruses, particularly the ones that are very destructive. Scan the removable media. After it's removed, reconfigure, reinstall the services and applications. So put the system back in operation after we get the infection off of it. Update potentially vulnerable software. And I think that hopefully you agree that all of that potentially vulnerable software is, if it's installed and it connects to the network, connects to the internet, it's potentially vulnerable. Regular security scans and updates. And I think what we did with our systems, and we had, I guess, a minor infection. It's nothing really major. A virus would show up every once in a while, but we had policy that everybody left the machine on when they got done at night. And the first thing that happened was, with the policy, is that an antivirus scan was run. Well, the first thing that was done is it checked to see if there were any definition updates for the antivirus software. Then we ran an antivirus scan. After that, we did a check with the WSUS server to see if there were any Windows updates. If there were, they were installed. If none of that happened, and after all of that was done, the systems shut down. We ran the shutdown command to shut them down for the night, so that they're not vulnerable during the time when nobody is there, that somebody could wake one of the machines up and use it for whatever reason. Disable unnecessary services, tighten the firewall. And this one shows up again and again and again. Disable unnecessary services, yes. Which services are unnecessary? You can go to a lot of different websites to get a lot of different lists. One of the ways, and this is me to check it, is if you think it's not, do the research, and if you think it's not necessarily, disable it and see if anything bad happens. If it does, re-enable it. And if it stops your connectivity, since you haven't saved anything by just disabling it, you can restart the machine and that service will restart. So then you have put it on the list of, yes, I shouldn't disable this one. Examine the system and application settings and specific measures to prevent a recurrence of these things. And a lot of times the prevent recurrence may be a modification of the policy, maybe just talking to the users, user education. And you see user education time and time and time again, because users are not necessarily knowledgeable about what things can do. The reason that all this spam goes on with the click and letting people steal money is because somebody's clicking on that stuff. If they weren't, they wouldn't be doing it because they wouldn't be making any money. User education is a really big deal. Discuss the findings with the involved users. How did the problem begin? The actions that the user took. And, maybe where they went to, it might not be the user's fault. They might have gotten one of the redirects across cross-site scripting, or may have gotten a DNS spoof that sent them to a dangerous website that they thought they were going to someplace that's right. Or it could be a typo. It's easy to make typos, and sometimes you wind up at places that you didn't really expect. So what happened? What actions did they take? Once they got there, what did they do? Did they close the browser? Did they go to someplace else? What happened? Policies, you have the users on policies and best practices, and then describe signs if a threat is not. Document the findings. Always document the findings, because we do that, lessons learned, and we keep learning the same lessons over and over and over again. Report to the admin and management. Are there potential risks elsewhere? And that's going to be based on the investigation. How did this happen? Where did it come from? Is it in the network? Is it being transmitted around? And potential risks, provable or suspected human attacks, policy violations. Policy changes, technical controls that could reduce the chances of recurrence. And these are things, the lessons learned, what can we change, how can we make it better, that becomes the responsibility of the IT individuals themselves. Software changes, and here we go, break, new topic here. Software changes, major versus minor, hotfix, service pack. Service packs, large compilations, and they can add significant things. And one of the things that usually comes in here is XP Service Pack 2 was one of the kind of major departures of Microsoft from the way they'd kind of done business before. XP Service Pack 2 installed firewalls, the firewall, and turned it on. And turned on a number of security controls, whereas before Microsoft been wide open. That everybody was an administrator, everybody was still an administrator in XP. You needed to make a regular user and be that, and then use the run as administrator. But Service Pack 2 put on the firewall and turned the firewall on to try to protect. A patch targets a single problem, and a hot fix, very specific, niche, high urgency. It may or may not be public. And if you then have the same problem, Microsoft does a lot better job of monitoring sometimes than we think they do. If you have an issue and you see some of those things, sometimes they'll send you a hot patch or a hot fix for a problem that you have that maybe you didn't even know that you had when you do those things. Service Pack, large compilation of patches. It brings everything up to date. It installs all the patches prior to it and may add services. An upgrade is a new software. When we go from Windows 7 to Windows 10, I guess we went from Windows 7 to Windows 8 to Windows 10. A maintenance release, smaller packages, bridge the service packs and the releases, and then a definition update, typical for security software. Unofficial patch released by a third party, and those are things that are kind of dangerous. Rolling releases replaces the discrete revision numbers. They just keep updating things, and I think that's kind of what the Androids do, and some releases of Linux do that. They just keep updating. They don't really change the version numbers. They don't go from a Red Hat 3 to a Red Hat 4. They just keep updating the current. This is planning software updates. First, it says evaluate the need, the risk, the security, the compatibility that you have in the system. So what we have said is, we're going to update. We're going to use the updates. I just let mine update. Consider the impact, and the impact is, and this is, I think, when you do these mostly for servers, the update risk, the driver update. problems with the software, the format changes, plan the update, have permissions, and the backups tested. And backups are a big deal. Evaluate the need, security, compatibility, and performance. When Windows comes out with updates, they say what it's going to fix. And they also tell you which other updates should be installed before you install this one. And I saw a guy kill an Exchange server because this update came out, and he put it on and the Exchange server died, and then he read the documentation. And after he read the documentation, it said update 8 should be installed before update 9. And if it's not, it's going to kill the Exchange server. Well, it did. So plan when you're going to do them, and updates. This is have a way to back out of these systems. If you're using virtual machines, the way to back out, obviously, is to take a snapshot before you do the update. If you are using physical systems, which most people are, then the backup. Have a backup and have a tested backup, know that you have data on your backup and that you know how to restore it before you do that, just in case you want to go back. Some updates can be undone, some updates cannot be undone, and those are other things to check before you do that. The static environments that we're referring to earlier is embedded devices, network appliances, printers, TVs, HVAC, Bluetooth, things that have, I guess, the operating system such as it is embedded on them. Kiosks, smart devices, the Internet of Things, the SCADA, the industrial environments, mainframes, mobile devices, your car. It says an emerging field. I had this weekend, we've got one that we don't drive very often, but it said it had a software update and to schedule the software update. So I scheduled, every time you turned the car off and turned it back on, you had to schedule the software update. It had to be done within the next 24 hours, and it took 2 days to get it done. So in-vehicle computing systems. And I said it was white hat hackers, but hackers have hacked at least one automobile. It was a Jeep. It was probably 12 to 14, 18 months ago. They didn't do a lot of damage. Just wanted to prove that they can. It took them about 1.5 years of observing and collecting and doing all of the steps, the precursors to hacking in order to get onto the system. But they did hack it, and they managed to run it off the road. No longer legacy systems, things that are no longer receiving updates, can be an issue. They're going to be vulnerable. They may be so far out of date that they're not vulnerable. Keep in mind that if it's not connected to the internet, it's probably not got a lot of vulnerabilities. We had a guy that had it was a tire balancing software that was DOS, and he was trying to upgrade the systems. He couldn't upgrade the system because his program would only run on DOS. And then you get into, now we're getting hardware that wouldn't run DOS, so he had an issue with those sorts of things. Alternative threat mitigation, the security layers of defense in depth, redundancy and diversity. The redundancy have multiple systems, the diversity, different manufacturers. All devices are going to have some weaknesses. They're going to have some vulnerabilities. The diversity is that one manufacturer's vulnerabilities will be different from another manufacturer's vulnerabilities, so that if one system's compromised, the same techniques won't work on the next system. Network segmentation, we've talked about that in VLANs, that we want to isolate, separate uses, I guess, put the servers, isolate the servers, isolate the students, isolate the faculty, isolate the admin folks. We can have some controls on these things. Are we going to completely eliminate? No, but it's one of the steps that we can do in order to, in part of our defense in depth. And then application firewalls, application layer firewalls, deep inspection firewalls, where the data packets are actually read. Lots of information there. Wrappers is an encapsulation process that we can use to protect some of the information as it goes across the network. Firmware and version control. Firmware BIOSes, I think, is something that you need to be careful of. I did on one of the routers that I have is, oh yeah, there's a new firmware version, click here. And I clicked there. And I waited, and I waited, and I waited. And my router quit working. Now, I could recover it. There was a backup copy of the firmware that I could put back on. But sometimes the firmware updates do those if it actually updates something that you need to have updated. So we'll finish up here with this chapter with mobile devices. And we'll talk about mobile device policies, and we talked about, this is some of this stuff is a continuation from Network Plus. Mobile authentication features, mobile data protection, security concerns with mobile devices. And security concerns are always going to be there with mobile devices. Phones in a secure area. You have the ability to voice record. You have the ability to stream. You have the ability to take photos. You have the ability to store data. So where can you take these devices, these mobile devices? Where do you not want the mobile devices when we do this? And we're going to get into geofencing here so that we can have them only work in certain areas. So the devices themselves, some things are only going to work with these things if we jailbreak them or get root access. iOS, the ability to install apps, and I think it's still true, other than from the Apple Store, you can't do it. If you want to install something else on a Linux machine, on an Android machine, which is Linux-based, you just have to go into the settings and say, hey, install apps from unknown sources, and it'll let you do that. Might not be a good jailbreaking, the ability to move it around to install things that you don't want to do to get root access, can be an issue with these things. Compromised firmware, operating system exploits, all the things that we've talked about for mobile devices, Trojans, suspect software in the app stores are there, or suspect apps that you find on the internet. Can you install them? They can be an exfiltration tool that we talked about. You can put data on them. You can take pictures with them. You can record with them. You can video with them. The cameras and the microphones that are available there. We have payment applications on them. And it's probably not so much of a threat, although many people will tell you that if it's put in the air, it can be intercepted. These things, I think the payment apps, the near-field communication, 10 centimeters, I think I read today, is how close that they need to be in order to work. But the payment apps themselves are going to have information about your accounts. So if they're compromised and get your credit card numbers or bank account numbers or whatever you're using to do the payment with. Mobile models. What kind of devices are we going to have? We have the corporate owned, business only. Those are the ones that the company owns, that you can only do company business. You can't use it for scanning, for surfing the internet. You can't use it for your personal email. You can only use it for business, which means that you're probably going to have two phones. The BYOD, bring your own device, it's our device. The issues here become how much security can we have? If we're having a BYOD, bring your own device, and I use my device on the network, the networkers can't dictate what kind of security I have to have on my device. Now they can say, you can't get on our network, but they can't dictate what goes on there. We had somebody that got hired as a developer, an academic developer, that was someplace in Texas, and the company was in Virginia. So it was going to be a remote access sort of arrangement. They found out that this developer had I think it was a 14-year-old, and I told you boys seem to be worse on this. So then you start wondering what could be on their device. Well, company couldn't say, hey, you've got to put this antivirus. Offered antivirus, didn't want to use it. You can't make them do that, but you don't have to give them access to the network. So what eventually wound up was a corporate-owned device went to the user, the developer, to connect to the network, because they were going to use remote access in order to, the work remote using via a VPN. So what's on the device? And that's something to consider. If somebody connects remotely to your network, they're on your network. What kind of infections does their device have? We don't know. And you can't make them be secure. Now, we talked last night or Friday night about the health checks, and we can do those when a device comes on the network. And we can put it on a network where they can bring themselves up to date. But we can't force them to do that. So bring your own device. How much access, where are you going to let them go? Bring your own device, a lot of times is, you can get on the wireless, but the wireless only goes to the internet. You can't access the actual information on the network. Corporate owned, personally enabled, one of those that the corporation owns it, you can do personal stuff. Corporation's going to manage the security profiles on these things. So choose your own device. You get into a situation that IT can't support every device that's available. So they make a list of devices that they'll support, and you have to choose from there. Sometimes you buy your own, sometimes you're supplemented with a payment, sometimes the company owns those. The virtual desktop infrastructure allows you to connect to a virtual machine, to a desktop that you can run remotely. Could be from a tablet, could be from a phone, could be from a lightweight operating system, as long as we can have a remote desktop connection to it. Is all that we really need to be able to do for that. The processing all takes place on the server with those things. The policies that we're going to have, and this is again a list, kind of like what are the permitted devices? Are we going to allow any device, or are we going to have some that we kind of understand for them? A security baseline. What's going to be the security baseline? Are we going to check them? Are we going to be able to put a security profile on the devices? Support ownership. Is IT going to troubleshoot these things for people? And sometimes you have to, because a lot of people have no idea what they're doing with these things. The app and the data ownership. What apps are allowed? Who owns the data? How do we keep the data secure? IP theft protection. Legal concerns. Privacy. The network access. Acceptable use. What happens if the device gets lost? Do we have a remote wipe? Do you require remote wipe? Do you have locating software on it, that if something happens to it, that it can be found? We had a program to where tablets, the company bought a bunch of tablets and issued them to students. And they'd lose them or whatever. Some people suspected that they were selling them, but one of the requirements that was in place was that the finding app had to be on the system. So some of them could be found, some of them couldn't. Obviously, they had to be on the network before you could find them because of the location data that was required. But what kinds of things are you going to have on these? And legal concerns. Who has what permission to do what? What kind of information gets put on the devices? And if it does, the PII, the personally identifiable information, have we protected it properly? And the privacy of the individual, what goes on in the protection of the information that we have. Acceptable use, onboarding and offboarding. How do we put these systems into the network? And then when the user quits or decides they don't want to use that on the network anymore, how do we get it off? What kind of permissions did it have? How do we undo all of the things that we had? And the other down to user acceptance of the procedures that we have. We can set up any kind of procedure that we want, but the bring your own device, the BYOD thing, people apparently feel comfortable using that. Just me, I can't see the small devices, so I like a nice big screen. profile security requirements, pass code requirements. You know, what kind of requirements are you going to have for the screen locks, basically, because the screen locks, if they're enabled, basically a password protected screen lock. Encryption settings. Do we have encryption? Whole device encryption? Are the data going to be encrypted? Is the device going to be backed up? And I think most of the iOSs do back up. I know when I went from one Android to another, I just said, hey, yep, it's backed up, and that's what I want to install it from, and it downloaded everything for me. Windows updates, backups and updates. Updates, probably not a big deal, I don't think, because every day, and you're probably the same way, I get up, I've got about 10 or 12 updates on my phone, and probably 4 or 5 or 10 on my updates are going to be there. What are the required apps? What apps are you going to forbid? And the physical security kind of alluded to. What happens to the device? How do we physically protect the device? How many devices, and I don't know, I was going to look it up, but you can probably find it at Google. How many devices get left in airports? They had a number a few years ago. So several thousand laptops get left in airports every year. How many tablets do you think get left? So what are you going to do if it's one of those that has, you know, some pretty important data on it for you? The remote wipe and the location software on it, pretty important. Acceptable use, we talked about what can they use them for. Can they use them for personal? Can they use them for business? How much access do we give to these devices? And the mobile device management, there's software that will do a lot of the management for you. Create the security profiles. What are you going to allow? What kind of security are you going to have on these devices? Some of them will partition the storage. This part is for work and this part is for you, so that the work stuff, the user says okay, or if it's the company that allows you personal use, the company creates the security profile for the company part of the device, and then you're responsible for the personal part of the device. But mobile device management softwares can be used to do those things. Screen lock options, and you guys probably a lot more familiar with that than I am. The screen wipe is nothing. You just wipe the screen up and you go. Could be a password. We could have a password on these things, a passcode or a PIN number on them. And the PIN numbers, you have to have a PIN, I think, for most of them in order to do the whole device encryption, because it uses the PIN as part of the generation process to create the encryption key for these things. Could be a pattern that we do, the Z's, the H's, or the whatever else. Draw a pattern on the screen to unlock it. A fingerprint scanner or facial recognition could be used. Keep in mind that the fingerprint and the facial recognition, all of these things can be fooled. Fingerprint, they talk about maybe somebody makes an image or takes it on tape and some black powders of some kind and on a fingerprint to use it on the fingerprint recognition device. Facial recognition, maybe a photograph, although they say that some of the new facial recognition as the photograph wouldn't work. Depends on how sophisticated the recognition device is as to what's going to happen with it, how far it's going to go in order to be more secure. Sometimes the fingerprint scanners check for temperature and pulse also, depending on how sophisticated it is. Device location software, I think that we've talked about those. Android Device Manager. I've got one on our phones. I forgot what it is. That was free, that they're always trying to sell me stuff. Read it. It's called Life 360. So there are a number of softwares out there that allow you to have locational data on the devices. Remote wipe, inventory control. Where are they? Who has them? Asset tracking. All of those become a big deal with the remote devices, particularly if you're going to put anything important on them, because they're small, easy to lose, easy to walk away. Sometimes people want them for what's on them. Sometimes people want them to take them and hawk them. so that, they just want the money for them. So what kind of configuration are going to be on these devices? Remote wipe, yes. Device tracking should be there. What kind of inventory control and asset tracking we're going to use? The full device encryption enabled by default on iOS, available on Android, and then the storage segmentation that we talked about. Some of the storage would be for the company and some of the storage would be for us. And then the company can dictate for the company storage, the company can dictate the security requirements for it, and then we can do ours. However, application whitelisting, things that we talked about before, key and credential management, geotagging, are you going to allow that? And you guys have seen, talked about, heard all this geotagging. One of the problems, I guess, issues with geotagging and people in general on vacation sharing everything in the world on their Facebook or whatever they're using about their great vacation 3,000 miles from home, and then somebody that wants to break into the house sees that and says, oh, nobody's home. Geotagging, you post an image. If geotagging is enabled, it will give the location of where you are when you are. Encryption, what kind of encryption are we going to have on them? Push notifications, application permissions. Containerization is kind of like, and these things really run the applications, containerization, run the applications in a sandbox. Sandbox is the applications are isolated from each other. Transitive trust. A transitive trust is that if A trusts B and B trusts C, then A trusts C. So the trust goes across the different devices, the different applications. A non-transitive, A trusts B and B trusts C, A does not trust B. So transitive trust is in the devices themselves. So the transitive trust authentication is available there. The connections, we know about Wi-Fi, we know about cellular, we know about Bluetooth. Ant is a fitness trackers, and I think that Garmin, it's a Garmin proprietary that they've licensed to everybody else. NFC, near field communication, payment, usually payment card or phone payment, is the way we think about these. SATCOM, satellite communications, and satellite communications generally going to be a state type of attack, because I'm not going to attack a satellite because I don't have the equipment to attack a satellite, but other states, state sponsored would be able to do that. Infrared is kind of here and kind of not. You may or may not. Remote controls, some of them are still infrared. Some of them are actually a wireless standard that's used. But infrared is something that was available, I think, in the late 90s, early 2000s. We had a phone and a laptop that had infrared on them and could communicate. You could download stuff from the phone, your contacts list and things like that. You could back it up with infrared. Line of sight, it's got some advantages, some disadvantages. Line of sight, it won't go through walls. It probably won't go through shades or anything like that. Anything that's going to block light is going to block infrared. It's very slow. Not in popular use anymore in the networking world. USB devices, you know about them. The problem with USB devices is you can get an awful lot of information on a USB device to walk out of the company with. Are you going to allow USB devices on? A lot of places, government, one of the places, just disable the use of USB devices. Then, how convenient is it? Some of them allow read-only on the USB devices because of data exfiltration, so that you can't copy anything from the computer to the USB device. So you can't get the company information to walk out the door with. But great devices for data exfiltration. And, wireless. So if we want to connect to a wireless, we put a USB dongle in the USB port, and we create a wireless. So we now have a wireless connection to the wired network. What are you going to allow on the networks? hardening the operating systems, and these are things that you're probably doing. Operating system updates. Probably have auto update configured on Windows. That's the default anymore. It didn't used to be. Linux does a lot of updates. App updates, application updates, software updates on the desktops, app updates on the mobile devices. Unused features, disable. And is there an antivirus software? And are the definitions updated regularly? Trusted sources. Who are the trusted sources? Are we getting the apps from the trusted sources? Firewalls. Are they on? Are they enabled? Are they activated on the devices themselves? And then Wi-Fi security. Do we have Wi-Fi security? Do we have WPA2 is what we should be using. WEP is what we should never be using. Actually, WEP probably not a whole lot better than an open system. Open system, no security on it at all. Are you using VPNs when you're on Wi-Fi? Confidential information, trusted information. How are you getting to if you're on a Wi-Fi, the unknown Wi-Fi, how are you getting to your bank? What kind of security do you have